Welcome to the Starting Over Podcast training series. I am your host, Edward Shelton, aka Dark Logos. And in this section, we're going to be looking at barrier. Barrier is what we call a hard control, defensive, and offensive option. Okay? It is a definite fact. You have to put down 4 squares of blocking terrain. That's it. There is very little else to say bluntly about it. But the thing that we can look at in our nuance of play is that barrier allows us flexibility on who has line of sight to what and when. Okay? We control during our turn who has line of sight to what and when. All right, so with that being said, let's get into it. Barrier. Give this character a power action. Place up to 4 blocking terrain markers in adjacent squares of clear terrain that are all within this character's range. Minimum range value 1. At least one of the terrain markers must be within line of fire when it is placed. The terrain markers remain until the beginning of your next turn. So, barrier. The coolness and the frustration that it causes. Coolness blocks off line of fire. You can surround a target in barrier and keep a character alive if they don't fly on an indoor map, or even if they do fly on an indoor map. You can stop your opponent from gaining line of sight to you. You can put barrier up so that you can create a single target pulse wave when before there was none. You can make it so that a quake attack will hit one target and not another target. There are lots of options for you to consider with barrier. But above all, the biggest thing that I want you to keep in mind, like I said before, you get to determine who has line of sight to what, when. So, let's take my first example. We put up barrier. We're able to create a single target pulse wave. And creating this single target pulse wave, if that barrier wasn't there, it would be a pulse wave that would affect either our characters or hit additional characters that we don't want targeted. Because of that use of barrier, we are now able to get off a full damage salvo against our opponent without them being able to super sense or use impervious or shape change or anything else. So that's a clear advantage. Now, what else have we done with that action? We could have blocked our opponent off from their probability control. We could have blocked our opponent's character off from their shenanigans that could have possibly saved them from pulse wave. You know, you never know. We also could have blocked off any attempt of our opponent the following turn to try to, outwit us. So, or use perplex to lower down one of our values. So, with that, we can see clearly that barrier allowed us in this instance to determine who could see during the attack, what couldn't be seen during the attack, when the attack happened, who had control, and what the placements were. Okay? So just let that marinate in your head. That's a whole lot to take in. Okay? Just let it sink in, rub your head a little bit, and rub your earlobes, say woo-saw, and let's look back at it. Okay. Now, that's pretty much very defensive in nature. We've had this wall off, and then we can say, oh, look, we pulse waved, and that was a bonus. Okay, so let's really look at some of the more offensive nature things that we can do with barrier. How barrier can create damage situations. Pulse wave, to an extent, is one. The other one is force blast. And I sort of talked about this during the force blast section. So if you want to go revisit that, I'll be talking about that element more in depth there. We can use force blast to knock an opponent into a barrier wall. Another thing that we can do that's pretty awesome is that if we have any sort of special a power or ability, such as League of Assassins team ability, that allows us to be adjacent to a wall, a blocking terrain or wall. We can't have range combat attacks drawn to us. So all of a sudden, barrier is very cool because now I have a character who can now just sit out in the middle of the battlefield because they're adjacent to the blocking terrain, and it's able to shoot. Now you might say, well, I just blow up the wall. All 3 or 4 pieces of blocking terrain, you're going to spend that many actions doing that just to get one character. Right. Okay, so we can see that barrier can provide a very strong offensive ability. Another thing to consider is this. When limiting line of fire to prospective targets can be beneficial to you with barrier. Okay, and you might say, well, what? That doesn't make sense. Limiting lines of fire. I thought I want to be able to target as many characters as possible. Most of the time, yes. But one thing is with our offensive options, what happened before in my example? We can block off our opponent's use of prob by putting up barrier. So that might restrict our targets, but by using barrier, it allows us to get our shot off unrestricted. Okay, so our opponent doesn't even have a chance to put up an option. When we are acting offensive, barrier makes sure that our opponent cannot obstruct our offense. When we are acting defensively, we are obstructing our opponent's offensive nature. That is how you have to see barrier. Okay? So it's really straightforward. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, like, hey, what type of character should I be looking for with barrier? Barrier, in all honesty, you need a character with high defensive numbers, preferably, unless you're trying to get barrier on the cheap. If you're trying to get them to survive, then you need to have a barrier piece with an 18D. Now, if a barrier piece with an 18D is outside your point range, or by chance you want to double or quadruple barrier for various reasons, you want to keep a perpetual wall going, or you just want to turtle really bad, I recommend that you get a whole bunch of low-cost barrier figures. A whole bunch of low-cost barrier figures. Biggest advantage is, hey, they can just sit there. They just sit there. If they do their job right, they won't get hit. So barrier is literally their only means of survival, and depending on another barrier piece is quite essential. So if you need it on the cheap, then yeah, go for low defense values, low attack values even. You're really not expecting these characters to do nothing more than sit there. Preferably they have other powers that allow them to just be passive while they actively use barrier. So enhancement, great power. Perplex, a great power. Outwit, a great power. But mainly enhancement, Hydra or PD team abilities, those are great. Shield, not really as much since you have to do a power action to increase damage. Those great little powers, if you're able to even sort of say like, hey, this character has like JSA or Defender's TA, then that can be cool too. Then at least that way you can share defensive values. But those are the main things that you really want to look for if you're looking for barrier on the cheap. Now, no, I am saying on the cheap. So here's what I want you to do. Depending on your collection, play with 3 or 4 barrier pieces on a team. Let's set the game for 600 points. And I want you to play around with the idea of running a constant 3 to 4 barrier pieces where every turn you have at least one set of 4 pieces of blocking barrier terrain up every turn. Okay? So that's your goal. Now, I want you to do 2 games like that, and here's why. The first game, you're going to either A, forget the objective, or B, be completely frustrated. for, just like, oh, I'm blocking myself. Okay. So I don't want you to be frustrated. What I want you to do is to be able to sort of realize, oh, okay, I need to put down barrier like this at the end of that game. And then on the second game, I want you to do better practice. Okay. So best practices, second game, getting used to it, first game, and sort of take everything in, and I'll see you next episode.